So we spent the last few weeks considering the first return of the people of Israel. Remember, the series is Captivity and Restoration, and we've seen some come back and start building the temple. And this week, we're back in captivity because we're going to consider the book of Esther. And I'm going to concentrate on the narrative of the book before concluding with some thoughts that we can learn from. As we've heard previously, in 539 BC, Cyrus conquered the Babylonian Empire. And what was the first thing he did? Amy and Bill, you saw the cylinder? They let them go home, that's right, to build the temple. And one of the subsequent kings following Cyrus, one of the descendants, was Darius. And he decided to invade Greece to force them to submit to him and give him tribute. And the city-states of Greece brought together an army to oppose Darius. And the two armies met together at a place called Marathon. And despite the fact that the Medo-Persians had overwhelming superiority, the Greeks managed to defeat them. And famously, Phidippades ran back to Athens to call the city, to tell the city the news of the victory. And of course, the distance between Marathon and Athens is 40 kilometers, approximately 25 miles. That's why we run the marathon in the Olympics. In 486 BC, the son of Darius, Xerxes by name, became king, and he decided to avenge the defeat of the Medo-Persians at Marathon and began planning his campaign with his military experts. And he actually did invade Greece in 480 BC and fought three famous battles against the Greeks: Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea. Now, has anyone seen the 300 films? Some have. Well, they're about the Battle of Thermopylae and the Battle of Salamis. So two out of the three battles have recently been filmed, and that's all about Xerxes. But he wasn't a 10-foot demonic figure, he was just a king. And he also happens to be the king who is in the book of Esther. And the book of Esther takes place between 483 and 480 BC. And we're told in chapter 1, verse 3, that the king, Xerxes, gave a banquet for all his army officers. And what he was doing was planning his military invasion of Greece. That's what that banquet was for. So he got all the army officers from across his empire together and was planning at the invasion of Greece. And so to show off his wealth in front of all of his army officers, he showed them what he had, but he also wanted to show off the beauty of his queen, Vashti. However, she didn't want to be displayed like a piece of meat before the lascivious eyes of the army officers, and so refused to come to the king's command, or wouldn't come to his banquet. And this made Xerxes less than pleased. It says in verse 12, "Then the king became very angry, and wrath burned within him." From his perspective, she had disrespected him in front of his honored guests. So the king, after consulting with his wise men, decided to hold a beauty contest. Why wouldn't you? The reward for taking part was that you got to spend the night with Xerxes. And thereafter you moved in with the other concubines. But it was only the most favored one who would become the queen. And into the picture comes Mordecai. And we're told in chapter 2, verse 7, that he's Esther's cousin, but that he's brought her up because her mother and father had both died. And we're also told in that verse that Esther was very beautiful. And so Mordecai wanted the best, the very best for her. And there was just one problem. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in the empire. And so Mordecai told her not to reveal her race. Some things never change. So Esther moved into the palace under the custodianship of a guy called Haggai, who was in charge of all the participants in the beauty contest before they went into the house of the concubines. And his job was to get them ready for their appearance by giving them cosmetics and food of their choice so that they would be at their very best when they met Xerxes. And Haggai took a liking to Esther and gave her every advantage in her 12 months of preparation, 6 months of oil and myrrh and 6 months of spices and cosmetics. Effectively, ladies, this was a year-long spa. How'd you fancy that? And whatever she was given, it worked. And Esther pleased Xerxes and became his new queen. And all of this part, those first few chapters, are the background to the story. Now we get into the real plot. In chapter 2, verse 21 to 23, we see a brief account of Mordecai uncovering a plot by some of his officials to assassinate Xerxes. And this becomes important later on in the story. So Mordecai has become aware of this plot, and he tells the senior officers, and they tell Xerxes, and he then has these plotters killed, but then he doesn't do anything else about it. And now, in walks the baddie, Haman. And when the Jews celebrate Purim to this day, and retell the dramatic story of Esther, just as I'm doing now, whenever Haman's name is mentioned, the audience boos. So you're allowed to boo every time I say Haman, okay? And Haman has been promoted to be the highest official in the land. And everyone expects everyone to bow down to him as he passes by. And Mordecai, of course, won't bow down to anyone because the only person he'll bow down to is God. So he refuses to do so because he's a Jew. And when Haman finds that out, he decides not just to take revenge on Mordecai, but to kill all the Jews in the empire. And he gets the king to agree to this proposal by issuing a decree accordingly, which was sent to all the provinces of the empire. And the decree read that on a certain day, on the 13th day of Adar, anybody in the provinces was authorized to kill all the Jews within their province. Nasty man, Haman. And when Mordecai hears the plot to kill all the Jews, he goes to the palace in a state of disarray, in sackcloth and ashes, and there gains Esther's attention. And he tells her of the plot and warns that even though she's in the palace, she will not escape. And he tells her that perhaps she has been raised up to her position for such a time as this. And Esther decides to pray and to fast for 3 days. And she asks Mordecai to get the Jews of the city to do the same. And her issue is that she's not been called into the king's presence for 30 days. And to go unbidden into the king's presence would mean death, unless he showed mercy and extended to her his royal scepter. And after 3 days fasting, she went to the king. And she stood in the outer courts. And there he spotted her. And she found favor in his sight, and he extended his royal scepter to her. And she requested that he and Haman come to a banquet. Still with it. Come to a banquet that she was preparing for them. And so they do. And they all enjoy the meal together. And Esther promises to tell the king her real reason for holding the banquet at another banquet the following day. And Haman is very pleased with himself to be honored in such a way. But on his way out of the palace, he sees Mordecai still not bowing down to him. And he goes home seething, and he prepares a gallows on which he will hang Mordecai on the day allocated for the destruction of the Jews. And we have a wonderful moment of irony. That night, the king cannot sleep, and so he calls for the royal records of a court activity to be read out to him. And he realizes that Mordecai was never honored for saving the king's life. And it's at this moment that Haman walks into the palace. And so the king asks Haman, what should be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? And of course, Haman thinks it's him that he's talking about. 1 or 2 more boos, please. So he suggests that such a person should be given a royal robe, one that the king himself has worn, and put on a donkey and paraded through the streets, and that the person parading him would say, this is what the king does for the man he chooses to honor. And so the king tells Haman, you go and do that for Mordecai. And of course he has to obey to his great embarrassment, and does exactly that before running home to his wife. And soon after this, Queen Esther gives a second banquet, and during which she reveals to the king of Haman's plot to kill the Jews, which would include herself. And the king is shocked, and he walks out the room. And as he comes back in, Haman is throwing herself on Esther's couch. And the king says, "Would you even assault the queen in my presence, in my house?" And so he immediately orders that Haman be hanged on his own gallows. But what can be done about the decree to kill all the Jews? It can't be undone. It's written in the laws of the Medes and Persians. But it can be countermanded. So a decree is issued that the Jews can defend themselves if attacked, and this gives them a chance to destroy their enemies. Thus, impending national disaster becomes a victory. So that's a summary of the plot of the book of Esther. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so. But I think there are three things we can learn from this story. First, let's consider Mordecai's words to Queen Esther. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this? God is in control of the world. He raises up who he chooses to. He puts down those he chooses to. And we see this demonstrated in the book of Daniel, as we see God raising up different empires to rule over the world. And in the case of this story, God had enabled Esther to be raised up to a position of influence, so that she was in the right place at the right time to bring about a deliverance for the people of God. And God can use anyone and everyone for his purposes. Esther was exalted because of her beauty. Daniel was exalted because of his wisdom. David was exalted because he was a man after God's own heart. Each one of us is unique. And wherever God places us, we have the opportunity to be an influence for good. You are in the place you are this morning, in your workplace, in your place in your family, for such a time as this. This is the moment that God has raised you up for. This is the time in which he's raised you up to be an influence, to speak a word, maybe a word that will bring a colleague to faith, maybe Christians raised up in the House of Commons to enact good laws or prevent bad ones from being passed. We all have the opportunity to use our godly influence for good in this world. And the important thing for each one of us is that we don't squander the opportunities that come our way, but that we know that we are in that place because God has put us there. And he's put us there for such a time as this. Secondly, we have the example of Esther going to the king. And this is a picture to us of our own access to the King of Kings. We have no right to come into his presence. We are born in sin and are undeserving of anything from him, as was laid out for us in communion. And yet, as we approach the throne, the Lord extends his grace and mercy to us through Jesus. And he receives us into his presence. Just as the king asks Esther, "What is your petition?" So God speaks to each one of us in our hearts and said, "What would you have me do for you?" He has the power to destroy us, but yet he extends his love, his mercy, and his grace to us. And he draws us towards him. And he says, "What would you have me do for you?" And so each one of us has the privilege of access. And this is confirmed in Romans 5:1. Therefore, since we've been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we've gained access by faith into his grace in which we now stand. We, each one of us, have the privilege of coming before the God of the universe and being received by him in love, grace, and mercy. And then thirdly, this story tells us that what the enemy means for evil, God can use for good. God can turn around the most appalling circumstances and bring good out of them. And when we're in the midst of such trials and tribulations, it's often hard to see how anything good can emerge. But God sees the big picture. And sometimes we just have to hold on to in faith to God's faithfulness, to know that he's a good God, that he's for us and not against us, that he's on our side. And even when it seems we can't see the way through, he knows the way through. And he will bring deliverance. And we could mention the various women of the Bible who were shamed by their failure to conceive. They had no answer to the situation they were in, but God intervened. Sarah, who gave birth to Isaac, who was the inheritor of the promises. Hannah, who gave birth to Samuel, the great prophet of Israel. Elizabeth, who gave birth to John the Baptist, the forerunner and herald of the Messiah. And we could think of others like Jeremiah, who was put through all sorts of horrors by the people he was trying to warn, but God fulfilled his prophecies, the prophecies Jeremiah had given, and particularly the one that spoke of the exile only lasting for 70 years. And we could mention Paul, who suffered much for the gospel, and yet his legacy is a church that still stands today and has been greatly blessed by the letters he wrote despite his imprisonment. In prison, you would think Paul would be ineffective, and yet God used his imprisonment to lay out for us the Bible. So let's rest in the knowledge that even when we don't understand what's happening or why it's going on, God does. And he will bring about his purposes in and through our circumstances. And so I conclude with the words of Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Amen.